Couldn't be more fundamental than that. More essential fatty acids in a more vegetarian diet reduce inflammation. And this is across the board. We use this for arthritis. We use it for inflammatory bowel disease. But let's look at a prototypic inflammatory disease of the nervous system, MS. Dr. Swank, who, as you may have heard, popularized the Swank diet, you may have heard of that, back in 1952 in the New England Journal of Medicine, found that those people who had a lot of fish consumption had low rates of MS, who had a lot of butterfat consumption had a high rate of MS in Denmark. He compared putting people on a low-fat diet with the typical time course of patients who did mainstream approaches as published by the Mayo Clinic, and found that the time it took these people to degenerate to the point that they could no longer work or no longer walk was dramatically slowed by just putting people on a low-fat diet. And he wrote this wonderful book. We look at the work of various people like Dr. Ornish and look at the data, and what we find is that there is no relationship to a low-fat diet in general now in terms of cardiac risk. And that, in fact, was the article that was published in this week's Newsweek magazine. It calls to our attention the fact that it's not the amount of fat in the diet. Here we see the third point, the Greenland Inuit Eskimos. At times of the year, 70% of their calories come from fat, and they have among the lowest coronary artery disease risk and lowest risk for Alzheimer's on the planet. You know, they're eating whatever it is, blubber of some sort. And so it's concluded that it's not the type of fat, it's the modifications of the fat. If you're building neurons out of hydrogenated, processed, trans-type fats, those neurons can't work because everything happens at the level of the membrane in the brain and really throughout the body. So you've got to give the brain and the immune system what it needs to function appropriately. Interestingly, if you look at the spinal fluid of MS patients, you find deficiencies of essential fatty acids. And you find, in addition, that if you look at the levels of the 2-series prostaglandins, right? When you're eating the wrong fats, you increase inflammation because you produce more of the PGE2s. If you look at that in Alzheimer's patients compared to controls, they have dramatic increases in prostaglandin 2 series, inflammatory mediators. And also, if you look at the isoprostanes, the damage to fat from free radicals, again, dramatically increased in the Alzheimer's patients. This is the fundamental for this disease. And this is where we need to spend our time, our efforts in saving our population. When you look at mice and you look at what happens when you feed them fish oil versus beef tallow, and you measure the production of inflammatory cytokines, I know I'm going quickly, you find that it's increased in mice that receive the wrong kinds of fat. Tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin-1 beta are inflammatory cytokines, and they are decreased in the animal models that, and even in humans, receiving the essential fatty acids. For example, in culture dishes, if you take monocytes and you measure the amount of interleukin-1 beta, an inflammatory cytokine, and that number goes down as soon as you increase the eicosapentaenoic acid content. Same thing with tumor necrosis factor alpha, as you know, a powerful inflammatory mediator. So arachidonic acid, which comes from meat, in the presence of the COX-2 enzyme, increases these prostaglandin 2 series. And here are some of the unique things that we can do to reduce that activity. Interestingly enough, though, let's look also at arachidonic acid in and of itself, AA. And what we find that in bovine heart mitochondria, if you take the mitochondria out of a cow's heart and you put it in a laboratory and study it, you find that as you increase the arachidonic acid, you damage complex 1 and complex 2, or complex 3 rather. That is to say, and therefore more increased production of free radicals. So essentially, if you measure hydrogen peroxide production, as you increase the concentration of arachidonic acid in these mitochondria, you get more and more increased amounts of hydrogen peroxide. What is it saying? It's saying that arachidonic acid is a mitochondrial toxin. So it's a selective inhibitor of complex 1 and 3. It damages the mitochondria. Arachidonic acid is a mitochondrial toxin. Where do we get arachidonic acid from? We get it from meats. And how does arachidonic acid become a player? It becomes a player in the presence of the COX-2 enzyme. What can we do to reduce the activity of the COX-2 enzyme aside from giving Celebrex? We use natural approaches like DHA, for example. So animal fats lead to arachidonic acid. That's a mitochondrial toxin. So we look at the foods that we eat and recognize the profound effects now on our physiology, that eating high on the food chain is damaging our mitochondria. A more animal-based diet increases risk of Parkinson's disease by 300% or more, as it does with Alzheimer's. More vegetables and antioxidants, lower on the food chain, and your risk decreases. Reduction in the human body, the amount of arachidonic acid, which precursor of the inflammatory eicosanoids, by dietary methods might offer a path to prevention of Alzheimer's disease without resorting to drugs having harmful effects from medical hypothesis. What a statement. It means if we tell people how to eat correctly, we could reduce the rates of Alzheimer's. And there are 5 million Americans with this diagnosis now. By 2030, that number is going to double. And this costs us currently $1 billion a year. Diet may prevent Alzheimer's. Nothing new there. We expect that. But diets rich in antioxidants and low in fat can reduce the risk. Data claims diet affects memory. Findings appear emerging pattern of data from many laboratories suggesting a buildup of oxidative damage is one key factor in brain aging. That's not a mystery. You're all aware of that. But let's put it to work. Let's make this work for us. Reduced calorie diet increases our resistance to brain dysfunction. If you eat a lot of animal products, your risk of Parkinson's, as mentioned, goes up 500%. We shouldn't be blocking fat. Big mistake. We need fat. Fat is desperately important. Let's get back to this mitochondrial dysfunction. We damage the mitochondria from the various drugs that we use, our depletion of the body of coenzyme Q10. We damage the mitochondria by using things like elevating homocysteine, and ultimately it leads to cytokine production, which is an inflammatory issue. So, again, the various foods that we eat, and when you go back to that previous slides, you see that elevated cytokines ultimately plays its role in genetic expression. That if I could go back, can I go back one slide possibly, Mark? If you have to do the whole thing again. Oh, wonderful. The point here is that these cytokines turn on the genes to make COX-2 enzyme, and that cytokine production is controlled by our diet. So our diets control, cytokines controls genetic expression. Our diets control our genetic expression. What we eat has a role to play in signal transduction, unraveling our DNA. So this idea that we are genetically predetermined it doesn't hold water anymore. We have some genetic predispositions, but what we eat causes expressions of our DNA. We'd like to know what our DNA issues are ahead of time. You can now do genomic studies looking at your what are called SNPs. There are various profiles that laboratories offer, but you can affect genetic expression. Time magazine says that the drugs of the future are going to affect our DNA. Our DNA has been affected by our food since the beginning of mankind, by everything we eat. But interestingly, I didn't put the slides in. I took a tour of Peru this past summer, and in one of the places we went, there the Indians had created this laboratory to test various foods. And this was done, 800-900 years ago. And the foods that they were testing were foods that were available at particular seasons of the year. Well, we all know the argument that we should eat foods that are in season, we should eat foods that are produced locally. But why should we do that? Because if foods affect genetic transcription, genetic expression, then the various foods that are available in nature will allow your genes to change your physiology so that you'll be healthier at that time of the year. That's how we co-evolved with the foods that are around us. So my point is that drugs of the future that we may never see in our lifetimes will affect genetic expression. Foods affect genetic expression. Exercise affects it. Emotion affects it.